The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. We're going to wait just a minute or two for any late arrivals, and then we'll get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, to the AcctTwo Period-End Allocations for Sage Intacct demo. My name is Peter Wagner. I'm the Director of Marketing here at AcctTwo. We hope you find this session valuable. I'll get us going quickly so that Brett has all the time he needs to show the module and take questions. First off, some housekeeping items. You can type questions in the question box in the GoToWebinar panel on the right of your screen. We will try to get all of them answered during this session. We'll allow for questions at a couple of different times during the demo. For any questions we don't have time to answer or any questions that are too involved to get to on this particular webinar, we will definitely follow up with you afterwards. You will also all receive copies of a recording of this webinar. So for those of you who aren't familiar with AcctTwo, we provide managed accounting services where we take on all or some of an organization's finance and accounting function. We use Sage Intacct as the platform for those services. We're also a Sage Intacct partner and a value-added reseller of Sage Intacct, as well as Adaptive Insights. We were named Sage Intacct's overall partner of the year for the last 5 years. For more information or to contact us, you can always visit us at www.accttwo.com. A quick introduction of our presenter today. Brett Michalson is our Chief Technology Officer. He began his career at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where he worked in the Systems and Process Assurance practice. More recently, Brett was a manager at in the advisory practice at Calvetti, Ferguson and Wagner, a Houston-based public accounting firm. Since March of 2011, Brett has been responsible for AcctTwo's technology strategy, both the development of our professional services team as well as the development of our own intellectual property. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Brett. And let me go ahead and give you controls, Brett. Take it away.
Great. Can you see my screen?
I can see both right now. I can see a blue screen as well as the demo screen on the right side. There you go.
There we go. Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for attending. My goal today is to walk through the Allocations product created by AcctTwo, show some of the flexibility in the product and some standard use cases for it. We'll plan to take questions at a couple different points in the presentation. I'm going to initially walk through how an allocation is set up and then running an example allocation. And then we'll take questions at that point. And then I'm going to go back and do a little bit more complex allocation once everyone has a little bit of foundation for how the product works. So to get started, I'm in Intacct. You can see I'm in my Allocations menu. Allocations is built on the Intacct platform. So it's a standard menu option in Intacct. It can be permissioned just like any of the other modules in Intacct. You can give permissions to the Allocations product or not to your users. And so there's no other logins, no other sites to go to. It's all built on the Intacct platform. For this demo, I've got two examples. My first example is a departmental allocation. So I'm going to edit this allocation. And the goal of this allocation is to take some cost in one or more GL accounts and reallocate the departments of that cost according to some basis. In this case, I'm going to use a statistical account that contains hours worked across those departments. So this is the standard allocation setup screen. The goal is to make this setup screen as easy to use as possible. So everything is right here on one screen. You can see there's there's not a whole lot to the screen, but once we get into it, you'll see it has a lot of power to it. Our system will auto number the allocation with a system ID, but you can give it your own name and your own description. You can post your allocation into any journal that you want, and that includes user-defined books. And so one of the things that we'll show you in this example is that if you want to be able to do an allocation without actually changing your accrual book, where you have a management reporting book, you want to be able to see the before and after in a single report even. You can do that by creating your allocation entry in a user-defined book. So in this case, we've set up an allocations book, and I'm creating my allocation entry in an allocation journal within that book. Here, the next set of options are a place that we can create the allocation entry. The default is the same as original. We're just going to take the balances out of an account and book it back into the standard, that same account. But you don't have to. You can move the balance from one account to another, or even take the balance in one account to populate other accounts from its balance. And you would do that by choosing a different allocation from and to account. So for example, if I wanted to move costs from cost of sales down to SG&A, my pool, which we'll get to in a minute, which is what I want to allocate, I might take it out of the pool, but I might move it to a new account, an SG&A account, for example. Finally, I have some advanced options. One of the things that we found as we started rolling this out was that companies would inactivate dimensions that were in their GL history because they didn't want them to be used again going forward. But then when they tried to look back and do allocations across those dimensions, Intacct throws an error message when you create a journal entry with an inactive dimension record selected. So we gave some options here. The option I have selected is to activate and inactivate any inactive dimensions. So what this will do is we'll actually, as we do the run, we'll look and see if any of the dimensions we're allocating to are currently inactive. And we'll activate them right before we post the entry, and then we'll inactivate them again when we're done. So to you, it's a seamless process where you're essentially able to book your allocation across inactive dimensions. But if you don't want that, we can have it throw an error message, or we can even ignore that dimension entirely from the account as though it was never there. So we won't try to allocate it. We won't try to allocate to it. We'll just ignore inactive dimensions. I'm going to skip the advanced options until the second run, so we have some additional questions. But here, this is the crux of setting up your allocation. So the main thing that you'll set up is an allocation pool. This is what you want to allocate. And in your option, you're going to be able to select GL accounts, statistical accounts. You're going to be able to select any of the account groups that you've set up in the system, as long as it's not just a computation. And we'll read all of the members of that group, or we'll read the values out of this GL account. And that's the value that we're going to reallocate. You can filter that balance. So any number of filters that you want. You can filter on any of the standard dimensions. You can also filter on custom dimensions if you would like. So user-defined dimensions are fully supported. Contract is fully supported. So all of the dimensions in use in your company can be used as a filter to get your pool to exactly what it is you want to allocate. So if you have, we also support groups here, dimension groups. So let's say that I choose to filter on a department. We'll read into this selection box all of your individual departments, but also if you have groups of departments, we'll read those as well. The filters are additive, so if you want to add additional filters, you can. We also give you the option of allocating just a percentage of the pool. So we had people give us use cases. For example, I have some employees that work and their cost is hitting cost of sales, but they're really split 50-50 between cost of sales and SG&A. I'd like to move half of their cost out of this cost pool from cost of sales down to SG&A. And so to do that, we allowed them to enter a percentage here. and we'll allocate 50% in this case. And you could add a filter for a specific group of employees, and you could choose the Allocate to be a SG&A account. You can filter for specific books. You can include multiple books if you'd like. So if you want to include your accrual book and your tax book for the purpose of the allocation, or the accrual book plus your ASC 606 book, you can do that. And once you've decided what we're going to allocate, this next area is how we're going to allocate it. And the how to allocate is by what dimensions you want to reallocate. And so again, we have all of the standard dimensions as well as custom dimensions. You can choose where we're going to get the percentage table to do the allocation. We can either grab it from an account or a statistical account, an account group or a whole group of accounts, or choose a static value. So I could say I want everything to go to Department 10. You could pick a static value there. Again, in the basis then, if you've chosen account, you'll see the list of all of your GL accounts and statistical accounts. If you choose group, you'll see your groups. And if you choose static value, you'll see all of your department records. Then you can filter by book, and you can add additional filters to the balance just like you could in the pool. So I could choose to only look at a certain group of departments as my basis. One of the other things that we do really well is we let you allocate to multiple bases at once. And so I can add additional lines, and I could say I want to not just by department, but department and contract, or department and location. And so you can have multiple, all the permutations of these dimensions will be allocated in your final allocation. So that is a brief overview of the setup of an allocation. What I'm going to do next is go to the Run Allocation screen. This is where you would run allocations. It's just a selection under the Allocations menu. One thing that I didn't cover that's probably worth talking about real quick is that in the Allocations menu, we also have Allocation Sequences. As soon as my screen loads. So I've created allocation sequences here. So I may have, for example, a set of month-end allocations. And once I've constructed my allocation, I can then create a sequence. And let's say here I have 2 allocations set in my sequence. I can add another one. And another one. And it's possible that your allocations, the sequence that they run matters. So the results of one allocation impact the running of the next allocation. If that's the case, you can just drag and drop your allocations into the order you want and then save your allocation sequence. So I'm going to go back to the run screen. So when I run an allocation, I can choose to either run it one or more individual allocations, or I can run one or more sequences. Here I'm just going to run this departmental allocation. So again, this setup, I've chosen a pool, which is a cost to allocate. I'm not going to filter the pool, and I'm going to allocate 100% of that pool. And I'm going to change the departments based on a statistical account that I have, which is an hours worked account. So I'm going to select that allocation. I'm going to choose a posting date. I have some old data in here as a test, but I'm going to post this entry on September 30th. It has a reversal posting date. We'll talk about that in a moment. Some of the advanced features are that you can indicate on an allocation that it's set up to be auto-reversing. If an allocation is configured to auto-reverse, then that specific allocation will create a reversing entry on the reversal date. If you run a whole sequence of 10 allocations and only 2 of them are set to reverse on the configuration of the allocation, then you'll have 10 entries and then 2 reversals on that date. Then you can choose the start and end date for your pool. So we don't force you to pick a specific month or financial period. You can run it for a week or half of the month or for however much a time you would like. It could span months. And then you can choose a start and end date for the basis. Generally, that's going to be the same set of dates, but it doesn't have to be. We've had some examples where people have wanted to take the results of maybe sales for the current month, allocate that to marketing campaigns from prior months, right? So you don't have to have the pool and the basis be in the same time period, although that in this case, that's what we're going to do because we want to take costs for the month allocated by the time worked in that month. I can choose whether my journal entry will be created in draft or posted or submitted. If we have a journal entry approval turned on, it'll submit. And then an email to send any success or failure notifications. So I'm going to go ahead and click Allocate. And while that's running, I'm going to come run a report. So this is a dimensional report out of Intacct's standard financial report writer. I'll make that a little bigger. So this report is showing a row for each of 3 hypothetical departments, X, Y, and Z. And maybe my costs are coming from my payroll entry. And in my payroll system, I have home departments for people. And I have $50,000 in Department X, $30,000 in Department Y, and $20,000 in Department Z. But when I look at where people actually spent their time, I can see that the time spent across these departments doesn't really reflect that home department very well. So for management reporting, I'm going to take this $100,000 and reallocate it to those dimensions. So that's a pretty easy thing to do. I ran that allocation. It's finished. I'm going to refresh this report. And you can see that's what the allocation has done for me, is it's taken my costs that I indicated in this pool. It's read the values in my basis, come up with a percentage table, and it's booked a journal entry that reclasses the departments from the original departments in the account based on the weighted average of my basis. And I booked that allocation entry to a user-defined book so that I can see both in the same report at once, right? I didn't lose any data. I didn't destroy any data by doing an allocation. It's completely safe. If I made a mistake, I can just delete my allocation entry in the user-defined book. The accrual book reporting didn't change at all. So I can run these allocation entries in a very safe way and see before and after and see what change that has made. So I think that's a good time to pause and take any questions, either about the allocation setup or about the actual allocation run that we've done.
So Brett, we've got one question, which is, does the allocations application work with the Action UI?
Yes, there's no issue with running the allocation product in the Action UI. I probably should have done that for this demonstration. I'm just still stuck in my comfortable familiar UI.
Right. Would the AcctTwo Allocations implementer build these validation financial reports for a client?
So let me actually answer that in 2 ways. First of all, our implementer, we have a standard fixed fee implementation, and that covers the installation into the company, as well as training with you and your team to set up your first allocations, and kind of hands-on support as you run that first allocation to make sure you're getting the data that you expect. As far as building these reports, we're happy to do that, but it wouldn't be part of that standard fixed fee because different companies may have any number of allocations they want to run or validations they want. But what we do, and what I would like to show, is that as part of the allocation process, we, on the journal entry that we create, we actually attach a file. Let me pull that up. So I'm drilling down from the report to the journal entry that we created. So this is the journal entry we created. And here you can see there's that $50,000, $30,000, and $20,000 entries for the old that was already in the account. And you can see in our memo, we've got a reversive pool, reversive pool, reversive pool. And then underneath that, you can see the $18,000, $36,000, $46,000 where we put it back in. And you can see the calculations that we've done here in the memo. we go a step further and we actually attach a document here. Open that. So we go a step further and we attach a document that shows you what basically the journal entry that we created and what all the dimensions were on it. We also keep track of what the pool was, any filters we had, the start and end date for the pool, the amounts that we found to allocate the pool, and then the basis as well, the start and end date for the basis, the values we found in the basis, the total of the basis, and the percentage we calculated in the math on the far right. So we take a snapshot of all of the filters and the data that was in the system at the point we ran the allocation. We create a file that shows you the journal entry we created and why we created every line of the journal entry. And then we include that with the journal entry that we post.
Brett, I've got another question. Can you roll back allocations if percentages change?
Yeah, these are just journal entries. And so here I have my user-defined book. This is my journal entries. If I refresh this, since I've run this one, you'll see I've got that journal entry here that we just created. All I have to do is delete that journal entry or reverse that journal entry, depending on your internal process, and you're ready to go again. Right? Because we booked this into a user-defined book, or even if we hadn't, if you booked it into its own journal, just removing the entry rolls it back. Any other questions?
Yeah. Here's a couple more questions. Our payroll is biweekly. Could allocations be used to calculate and record accrued payroll at the end of each month? Yeah, so one of the things that we can use this allocations tool to do is to create accruals, reversing accruals, because the actual allocation itself can be set up to auto reverse. You can take a look at some account. You can allocate more than 100% of the account, as long as you have a basis of how you want to allocate it in an account of where you want to put it. And it's based upon data that's in Intacct and in these accounts. You can do an accrual and reverse the accrual automatically as part of the allocation process. And you could do one allocation mid-month and have that auto reverse at the beginning of the next month, or at the end of that month rather, and then do a second allocation at the end of the month for the entire month. And that would work as well. And one more question before maybe you go to the next section. Can you allocate cost by employee and time that specific employee worked? And can you run that allocation by all employees for a specific group of employees?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The answer is yes. We built an advanced feature for that. So if that's the end of the questions, what I'm going to do is go on to the second allocation that's a little more advanced, and I'll address that one as we go through that application. Make sense?
Great. Thanks, Brett.
All right. So let's go back to my allocation. So that was a very simple allocation. We just allocated the departments from a pool to a basis, based on a basis. There's a lot of advanced things that we can do. So in this example, I'm going to pull up a department and project allocation, and I'm going to try along the way to address Leslie's question about the specific employees. So here, this is a slightly more advanced version of the allocation. This is department and project. So again, I'm booking it to my allocations book, and in this case, I'm not moving the balance still, although I could. But I'm going to click in this advanced options button and see some of my advanced options here. The first advanced option you see is to do an individual allocation by a dimension. And initially, entity is preset. And so out of the box, without making a change, an allocation you set up is going to run separately for every entity in your company. So it's going to say, I'm going to take entity 1's cost and allocate it by the time in entity 1, and entity 2's cost and allocate it by the time in entity 2, and so on. But I can select additional dimensions here. So if I say I want to allocate a specific employee's cost by that specific employee's time, all I have to do is add the employee dimension to this list. And with that 2 clicks, now the way the allocation is going to run is it's going to automatically filter the pool for the first employee it finds and filter the basis for that employee and do an allocation. And then it's going to continue running through all of the different records and all the permutations of the dimensions selected here in order to get to a final result of taking, people have different cost basis, right? So it's going to take my time, my cost to my time, and your cost to your time, and so on. There's another selection box here that says apply the individual allocation filter to the basis or not. So if I want to take my cost and allocate it to my time, I'll check it. But there are scenarios where I want to take costs by each individual entity or employee or department, but not filter the basis. And generally in those scenarios, it's where I just want the dimension to come from my pool, and it doesn't exist in my basis. So maybe there's a item dimension in my pool that I want to flow through to my allocation entry, but it's not in the basis. My basis is maybe just percentage of ownership or something. So there I could choose to item so that I run one for each in my pool for each item. I do a separate allocation for each one, but I don't filter my basis by that item because I wouldn't have a value. Right? So those are those 2 features there. Combination, we'll get to this in just a moment. So down here, I'm not only allocating by department, but also by project. And I'm choosing to allocate multi-dimension allocation in combination, which means I'm going to take every permutation of department and project and make that an entry in my percentage table when I do my allocation. I could do them separately. I could do one department allocation and one project allocation. Now, why would I do that? If you have too many allocation basis selections and there's too many records in each one, you might be trying to create a 1,000,000-line journal entry if you're doing all the permutations. Whereas if you chose to do them separate, you might be creating a several hundred or even 1,000-line journal entry. The only downside is if you do them separately and you try to filter your financials, you'll get all the right data if I just want to filter and look at it by department, or if I just want to look at it by project. But if I want to look at it by both department and project, I won't have any values. So generally we'll use combination, but separate would be used if you just have so much, you're trying to create 1,000,000-line journal entries and you still want to be able to get reporting by those different dimensions, but you're okay with not getting them at one, the reporting across all of them at the same time. We also allow for cross-entity allocations. So you could take, if you have an operating company and it has some cost and you want to allocate it, maybe there's a rent cost, and we want to allocate it to the subsidiaries by their square footage. You can select a source entity and we'll post all of the intercompanies for you as we create the allocation entry across companies. We talked about auto-reversing. You can flag an entry to be auto-reversal. That would generally be used if you had a mid-period accrual and then you're going to do a final allocation at the end of the period. And you can book your allocation, your reversal, into a separate journal if you prefer. In this example, I'm showing off a couple of additional features here. So I've got a pool, but I'm filtering it for a specific location, in this case, location 10, my LLC company. So I'm only going to allocate my costs for my location 10. And then in my basis, I'm going to allocate not just to departments, but also by project. And again, I'm going to filter these for just location 10. But you can see I can do this, make this choice separately 3 times. I can have a very granular, complex allocation built by selecting separate pool and bases and different filters in each area. I think there was another part of that question that Leslie asked if she only wanted to do the allocation for a specific group of employees. That would mean I take my pool, I add a filter, I choose the employee dimension. And so in this filter, I can either filter for a specific employee in the dimension, or I can filter for a whole group of employees that I've created using the standard employee group function in Intacct. And this will result in only allocating this particular group of employees. So I'm going to go ahead and run this a little more complex allocation. And then as that runs, I'm going to pull up another version of the report. Blow that up a little bit. Okay, so this is essentially the same report as we had before. I have costs broken down by department X, Y, and Z. I still have 100,000 of costs, and I still have 50 in X, 30 in Y, and 20 in Z. And I still have a basis of hours worked, and I still have 18 in X, 36 in Y, and 46 in Z. But this time, you can see maybe my payroll has no concept of what projects people worked on. All I have is a home department there. And so in my basis, though, the time worked, I have the time not just by the department, but by the projects they worked on within those departments. All the permutations exist in the basis. And so the goal of this allocation would be to take that $100,000 and not just move 18,000 to department X, but to also spread it out across the projects appropriately. The allocation's done running. I'm going to refresh this report. And you can see that's what the allocation has done. Because I selected to run it for the permutations and combination, the departments and the projects. It's taken that $100,000, it's removed it from the original department X and no project, and moved it into all the permutations, the department and project. If I go back and look at my journal entry that was created, I've got this additional entry now. Again, I have my memos, right, where I took the 50,000, 30,000, and 20,000 out to reverse the original pool. And you can see the filters. Location 10 was filtered. And then you can see all the math that we did to create all those different entries across the permutations of project and department. Again, we have this attachment. That gives you all the detail. And so here you can see the locations and the projects and the departments that we coded to. Here we had our filter, right? We filtered for location 10. We had the values that we found, $100,000, the source, the filters on the basis, the start and end date for the basis, and then the values we found, the percentages we calculated, and then the math that we did out. So I think this is a good time to stop and take some additional questions on some of the advanced features.
Great. Thanks, Brett. Here's a question. When allocating pools of expenses, are the details of that expense, i.e. the vendor, description, location, class, employee, etc., are those retained when allocating?
They are if you select them to be. We're only going to retain the dimensions that you either select in the basis or that you choose in the individual allocation by. So if I come back to my allocation, which is all the way over here, if I want to retain, it's a little complicated, right, to say, let's say in my initial balance I have two departments, A and B, and it's 50-50. And then I want to allocate it based on a project, and I have three, and it's 33, 33, 33. Well, in order to retain the same percentage, weighted percentage of vendors, but also have the final percentage breakdowns of projects, I've got to take the first department, A, and which represents 50%, and essentially allocate it itself to the three projects, and then take Department B and allocate it to the 3 projects. And that's what we do here by choosing the individual allocation by dimension. So if you select it here, it gets retained, or if you put it in the basis, it gets retained or added. And does the allocation journal entry trigger intercompany entries? Yes, it does. You have to select a source entity so that we know where to go look in the Intacct configuration for your intercompany setup, for your relationships between the entities, what payable and receivable accounts to use. But if you select a source entity, then we will automatically book the intercompany postings for you.
Great. I don't see any other questions right now.
Okay. Well, that is really all I had to demonstrate. So maybe we leave it open for a minute or two to take additional questions, or if you want to take it back and sort of finish housekeeping. And happy to answer additional questions after the call if anyone has any.
Great. Thank you, Brett. Let me know if you can see my screen again, and we'll keep an eye on questions. Actually, we've got one here. Could you show what the allocation sequences setup looks like, or the logic behind it? Here, I can give you controls back if you'd like.
Sure. See my screen again?
Yep.
Yeah, so under allocations, the menu is very simple. We have the run allocations choice, the allocations list where you set up allocations, and here's where you set up allocation sequences. We also have some run logs. So for example, if you try to book an allocation into a closed period, or there was an error for some reason, you'll get this in the log. But the allocation sequence is very simple. I can create a new allocation sequence. Give it your own name. So example sequence, I can give it a description. And then I just add rows and select the allocations I want. I can search for them in the list. There's my demo department test 1. There's my test 2. If I wanted them to run in a different order, I can just drag and drop them into the next order. And then when I'm done, I create that allocation sequence. And then when I run allocations, instead of choosing a specific allocation, I can select this radio button to choose to pull allocation sequences instead. And now my drop-down list are those sequences, including that example sequence I just created. And that's it. That's all there is to it.
Great. Thank you for showing that. We'll see if anything else pops through in the next few seconds. Let me know, Brett, if you see my screen again. One question, is there anything on your roadmap for the allocations tool? Any additional functionality?
Yeah, so we do. We just released user-defined dimensions. That was the major release that came out here in the end of October, beginning of November. And that's available everywhere in the basis and the filters and the individual allocation by. One of the next major features we plan to release would be to choose to be able to pick weighted average as an option. So rather than just pick the balance over the course of a period of time, to look at the average of the dimension balances of every day over that time or every month over that quarter, and do your allocation based on a weighted average. There are a handful of other pretty significant features in the roadmap. Actually, one other one that we just came out with was we had companies trying to create 20, 30,000 line journal entries as a result of this, because it's kind of this power that they've got now to do massive permutations of allocations. And Intacct just doesn't like that through the API. So we created a configuration where you can choose a clearing account and we'll chunk your allocation into pieces and create up to 5,000 line journal entries for you, so that you can have larger allocations than would normally be accepted by the system. On top of that, we've had a couple of other features that have been discussed as being possible roadmap items. That percentage to allocate is a hard-coded number right now. We've had some people ask whether they could pick a percentage to allocate from a statistical account or from some other source. And that being said, too, I mean, we plan on have regular releases for this product as long as there's enough interest from the community. So if you have features you'd like to see, happy to hear them. And if they're the type of feature that would benefit a lot of different possible customers, then we'll add it to the roadmap. If it's a feature that's very specific to your use case, we can talk to you about a bespoke customization of the allocations product for your use case.
And can you talk a little bit about the availability of the tool, Brett, the subscription details and all of that?
Yeah, so it's an AcctTwo product. It's out on the marketplace. So if you went to the Intacct marketplace, you could search for it and find it there. It's an annual subscription with a fixed fee implementation. It's a pretty fast implementation. We can generally install it in 2 days. And then there's the rest of the implementation fee is really training. So we have detailed meetings with you to help you set up your first allocation. And as you're running that allocation, if you're not getting the results you wanted, we're here to help troubleshoot it really through your first month of allocation.
And a more specific question, this is a clarification. Somebody's asking if they want to allocate expenses for a business line and allocate to other business lines, but must retain the detail. They just need to select the fields or dimensions they need, such as vendor, class, description, etc. Would it be possible to show an example of that?
Yeah, I can do that quickly.
Okay.
So, try sharing. You see my screen?
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to go back to my allocation list, and we'll just choose this simple example again. So I'm going to click on my advanced options. Right now, this allocation is only going to, the posting for the allocation is going to reverse the departments that were in the pool and put them back in based on the statistical account. But if I wanted to pull dimensions from the pool in my allocation entry, then I can simply select class, item, vendor, and I'm going to uncheck this filter the basis by these dimensions. So now they're just going to get pulled in from the basis, from the pool rather, but they won't filter the basis so that I don't have to have my basis by all of these different dimensions also. And the result of that is going to be that any of the dimensions that are in my pool, at whatever percentage they are in the pool, they're going to flow through. And then the basis is going to be the change, the new dimensions that are going to be different are going to be driven from the basis. But all of the collective dimensions here and in the basis will be on the final entry. And you have to be a little bit careful about that, because the more dimensions you select here, the more permutations you create. So if I have 20 vendors and 10 classes and 5 items, that's 20 times 10, 200 times 5 is 1,000. And then if I have 10 departments, that's 10,000. So these numbers, is the more dimensions you need on that entry, the larger your journal entry can become quickly. Oftentimes you don't need these dimensions to come from the pool because they're still sitting in the account. So if you were to filter the account by vendor, you'd still have the same breakout. But if you were to filter it by vendor and department, you'd see the original, because the adjusting allocation entry didn't have it without selecting it here. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question?
I think so. Thanks, Brett. Let's see if anything else has come through. Oh, no, that didn't answer the question, but maybe we can follow up afterwards. This might be worth a separate conversation, if that's okay.
Sure, and I recognize this is a little confusing. I think we've actually thought about changing the name of this field to say retain from dimension from pool, right? If you think about this as retaining a dimension from the pool, you just select the dimensions you want to retain from the pool. We have the other capability, which someone asked about, is I want to take Brett's time by Brett's cost and allocate it by Brett's time. And so that's the kind of an additional layer where you want to filter the basis by all these dimensions as well while you're doing your allocation. But really, this is what dimensions you want to retain from your pool. And then if you want that capability of saying, like, not just to do retain the employee from my cost, but actually only allocate that employee's cost by that employee's time, then you would check this box. But all the dimensions you want to keep from your pool, you would just select up here.
Thank you so much.
And I guess if that is getting a little bit complex, so if there are additional questions around that, happy to follow up after the webinar.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that, Brett. I wanted to show just briefly a quote from one of our customers who's actually using the period-end allocations module. Laura Gray, the controller at Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services in New York, has seen a reduction in the time it takes to manage year-end allocations from 2 to 3 weeks down to just 2 to 3 days. And she's seen month-end allocations that can be done with a click of a button and new allocations that they can set up in minutes with just a few clicks. So wanted to share that with everybody as well. If you have any further questions or want to talk about this more in depth, or if there's something that Brett wasn't able to cover on this particular webinar, please reach out to Ryan Coronado, our professional services sales rep. You can see his contact information on your screen. We'll make sure that we include Ryan's contact information as well in the follow-up email that you guys will get, as well as a link to the recording. And unless there's any other last-minute questions to come through here, or Brett, anything else that you'd like to add, we really appreciate everybody joining us today. We hope we can help support your business or your nonprofit's mission. And thanks again for joining us. And thanks, Brett, for showing us the allocations module.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, great. Give you guys a few minutes of your day back, and have a great rest of your Thursday.